Okay, class, in this lesson we are going to introduce to you some geometric vocabulary words as well as notations and symbols so that you have a foundation from which to work when we start introducing geometry. So to summarize, here is our learning objective for this lesson so that you can keep this as a forefront. Okay, so at the end of this lesson, you should be able to define a point, also define a line, a plane, line segment, a ray, and then an angle. In addition to that, you will be able to identify parallel lines, perpendicular lines, collinearity, and coplanarity. Okay. So what you're going to be able to do here is you're going to be able to define, and then you're also going to be able to identify. Okay. Most of these words you're probably familiar with, but words like collinearity and coplanarity are probably new to you, and it's important that we understand what those are. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing we want to go over is a point. And a point is simply a location in space, and it's usually named by a single letter. And it would look like this. You have a point, and you would give it a letter. Let's say it's T. Okay? And the notation in geometry would just be T. Okay? All right, pretty straightforward. Then the next item is called a line. I think we all know what that is, but let's go ahead and define it. Okay? So a line has no thickness, it has no width, and it extends infinitely in both directions, opposite directions, through 2 points. And an example would look like this. You have a point N and a point O that are connected and they extend infinitely in opposite directions. Okay, so that is a line. And the notation for a line in geometry would look like this. That is line NO. Okay, so let's go on to the third item, which is a plane. So a plane, which is not an airplane, but a geometric definition, is essentially a flat surface. It has no thickness, it has no depth, and it extends infinitely in all directions. Okay, and an example would look like this. Okay, so you notice that there's a point T, a point F, and a point A. So there are 3 points that make up this plane. And the notation for a plane would look like this. We would just call it plane TAF. Okay, so the fourth item here is a line segment. And a line segment is a part of a line with defined starting and ending point. Okay, so different from a line, where a line extends in opposite directions infinitely, a line segment actually has a finite line. So an example would be this. You have point T connected to point B, and you notice that it is finite. It does not extend infinitely in opposite directions. Okay, and then the notation would look like this. Okay, so you write the letters TB, which are your points, and then a bar over it. Unlike the line where you had arrows above the points, here we just have a line without the arrows. And then lastly, we have a ray. An array is defined as a part of a line with defined starting point, but extends infinitely in the other direction. Okay, so here's an example. Okay, so we have point O and point B. Okay, the defined starting point is B, but it extends infinitely past O. Okay, notice here that because it starts at B and it goes infinitely in this direction as O, the notation is as follows. We would call this ray BO. Okay, if it were the opposite direction, in other words, if we had this as an example, okay, where it starts at O and it extends infinitely towards B, then this would be called ray OB. Okay, so the order of the letters or the points matter in this case. Okay, the next one is angle, and that is defined by two rays that are opposite of each other, not exactly opposite, but in opposite directions, starting at the same vertex. Okay, so here would be an example. Okay, so we have this as the vertex. From here into that direction is one ray, and then from the same starting point of this vertex going in this direction is also a ray, and that forms an angle, and here we have angle 4, and the notation looks like this. Okay, and we call it angle 4. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on to the next part, which are parallel lines, perpendicular lines, collinearity, and coplanarity. Okay, so the first is parallel lines. Okay, and parallel lines are essentially two lines that are the same distance apart and will never intersect. So we have two lines here that are the same distance apart and they will never intersect. And the notation for this looks like this. Okay, so line A and B are parallel. The slashes in between the A and the B indicates parallel lines. Okay, so the next one is perpendicular lines, and that is defined as two lines that intersect at a 90-degree angle. Okay, so an example would be this, and if you notice, this little symbol here tells you that those two lines are at a 90-degree angle. Okay, so line A is perpendicular to line B, and the notation would look like this. Okay, line A is perpendicular to line B. Okay, and now we're going to move on to collinearity and coplanarity. Okay, so if something is collinear, it represents something that is lying on the same line. So in this case, points that lie on the same line would be considered collinear. And here would be an example. Points A, B, and C, because they're on the same line, that is, they are considered collinear. And then coplanar would be sets of points that are lying on the same plane, and that's why it's called coplanar. So here would be an example. So we see that points A, B, and C are collinear to this line. It is also coplanar because it is also part of this plane. And then points H and point E are also considered coplanar because it's all part of this plane. So here I've added a few more points, and I wanted to just point out that point D, okay, is not coplanar because it is above the plane. And then similarly, points K and F are not coplanar because they are below this plane. Okay, so they would not be coplanar. Now, points F, K, E, and D would be considered collinear to line FD. Okay, this line right here, they would be collinear to each other, but they would not be collinear to this line, AC. Okay, and then again, points D, K, and F would not be coplanar. Okay, so I believe that covers all of the topics. There is one other thing that I wanted to point out, which is a subtopic, and that item is called opposite rays. Okay, so opposite rays, they are collinear. Okay, so they're on the same line. They extend in opposite directions like this, okay, in opposite directions. And then they also have a common endpoint, okay, and this is the common endpoint here. So from the common endpoint, they extend in exactly opposite directions, and these are called opposite rays, okay. And then one minor correction here. Even though we are in a math class, it's important to spell things correctly. Collinear is spelled with 2 L's. Okay? Okay, so then the last definition I wanted to cover here is called congruent notation. So in congruent notation, we have congruent segments or angles that have the same measures. Okay? In geometric drawings, identical tick marks indicate congruent segments or angles. So for example, if we have congruent angles, they would look like this. So in looking at these two triangles, we see that there's an angle of 100 right here and an angle of 100. Okay, so we would say that angle RQP is congruent, and the congruent symbol is this little tilde with an equal sign underneath, is congruent to angle VTS. Okay? Okay, similarly, you'll see that the segment RQ is 5 and the segment VT is also 5. So we would say that segment RQ, I'm going to write this like this, RQ, okay, with the bar over it, is also congruent to VT. Okay, so this congruent symbol means that it's the same shape and size. Okay, so let's go ahead and review. We indicated at the beginning of the lesson that you're going to be able to define a point, line, plane, line segment, ray, and angle, and we've defined that already. Here we've got a point, a line, a plane, line segment, a ray, and an angle. And then we also said you would be able to identify parallel lines, perpendicular lines, collinearity, and coplanarity. Okay, so we did that over here. Collinear lines or points lying on the same line. Something that's coplanar, they're lying on the same plane. We also introduced opposite rays, which are also collinear. Okay, and then we also added congruent notation, which is what this looks like. And you can identify congruent angles and congruent segments. Okay, so a lot of information was thrown at you. If any of this was unclear, please go back to the beginning of the recording and review this again. It's really important that you have a solid understanding and foundation for these geometric notation, symbols, and vocabulary. Thank you.